That night, the storm uncovered what should have never been seen. The earth itself rejected the dead, and I saw the body lying in the mud.
I've never been the kind of man easily impressed by stories of ghosts or rumors circulating among my elders, as I've always believed that a gravedigger's job requires more resistance to the imagination than to the shadows that haunt cemeteries. But on that particular night, something unusual happened, something that would stay with me for the rest of my life. When I first heard that a coffin was about to be buried with thick chains securing its lid, I imagined it was just a family exaggeration, some strange custom, perhaps a way to maintain security against grave raiders. But the closer I got to that box, the more I understood there was nothing ordinary about that burial. The chains weren't there by chance, not simple iron links draped over the wooden lid. They were heavy chains, secured with rusty padlocks that looked decades old, perhaps even older, as if each link was meant to imprison not just a body, but something that should never be resurfaced. As I watched the coffin being lowered into the grave, I had the strange sensation that the weight of those chains wasn't meant to prevent anyone from opening it, but rather to contain what was inside. And the thought made me shudder in a way I'd rarely experienced in all my years of work. You might think this is just another superstition, but when a coffin is lowered into the earth chained, the inevitable question arises and won't leave you. What exactly needed to be kept so bound? What if I told you that, the next morning, everything that seemed impossible turned into a living nightmare? If this story has already given you goosebumps, subscribe to the channel and leave your like so you don't miss the next stories that are yet to come. The night that coffin was finally buried remains etched in my mind as if it had happened yesterday, for there was a heaviness in the air that wasn't explained solely by the tiring work of digging a deep grave in damp soil, but by a strange atmosphere that seemed to watch our every move. The cemetery was shrouded in such a dense silence that even the rustling of leaves sounded like an uncomfortable whisper, and the cold wind blowing through the trees caused the lantern flames to flicker erratically, casting shadows that moved as if they had a life of their own. The men with me avoided exchanging words, and when they did, it was only as much as necessary, because each seemed to sense deep in their hearts that this burial was not like the others, and that what we were about to bury carried more than flesh and bones. When the hearse arrived, dragging with it the metallic echo of the chains that wrapped the coffin, we all fell silent, watching the scene with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. The sound was disturbing, for each time the body rocked, the chains clanged and clanged like a warning that no one dared ignore what was happening before our eyes. Never before had I seen a body stored in such a manner, and yet I could tell, from the furtive glances of the family members, that there was an ulterior motive for such precaution, as if they all carried a secret they preferred to bury with the deceased. Lowering the coffin into the grave was one of the most tense moments of my life, not just because of the physical weight, as the chains made everything more difficult and tiring, but because of the psychological weight that seemed to crush our shoulders. Every creak of the creaking wood, every slam of the chain against the lid, seemed to echo inside my head like an insistent warning. As the earth began to cover that box, I felt we weren't just burying a body, but sealing a silent pact with something that should never be disturbed. And yet, as I shoveled the last shovelful of dirt and walked away from the grave, I couldn't help but feel that the suffocating silence didn't signal the end, but merely the beginning of something I didn't yet understand. For the next morning, upon returning to the same spot, reality would reveal that the darkness we had covered with earth had other plans. The next morning, when I returned to the cemetery to continue my routine work, I never imagined I would encounter the scene that still sends shivers down my spine every time I close my eyes. The sun was still rising timidly behind the tall trees, casting pale beams of light over the rows of damp graves, and the air carried the distinctive scent of freshly turned earth, mixed with the metallic aroma of the chains that had been buried with the coffin. As I walked toward the grave, I immediately realized something was amiss. The mound of earth we had leveled now seemed disturbed, as if invisible hands had dug it during the night, and my first thought was that some vandal or cemetery robber had dared to desecrate the deceased's resting place. However, what I saw as I approached dispelled any rational explanation I might have attempted. The chains that had been securely fastened around the coffin lid the night before now littered the ground, twisted and broken in several places, as if ripped from the inside out by a force unlike anything human. The iron, which always resists time and the weight of the earth, seemed to have given way, as if it were nothing more than a fragile piece of rope. The coffin was there, still resting within the grave, but the lid was open, and the interior completely empty. There was no sign of the body we had buried. No tissue, no bones, absolutely nothing but the dark, silent space that stared at me. Like an abyss, the despair that gripped me in that instant was suffocating, for I knew no plausible explanation could justify what lay before my eyes. The grave showed no signs of invasion from above. The earth was not scattered haphazardly, and even if someone had attempted to remove the body during the night, there were no footprints, no traces of transportation, no tracks of wagon wheels or any other vehicle. It was as if the body had simply vanished, evaporated from matter, leaving only the broken chains as mute witnesses that something impossible had happened. As I stood still, trying to comprehend the inexplicable, I felt the silence around me grow increasingly heavy, as if the cemetery itself were awaiting my reaction. And in that moment, I realized that it wasn't just me wondering where the body was, but that there was a strange sensation in the air, an invisible expectation that this was merely the harbinger of something even more disturbing to come. It didn't take long for news of the open tomb and empty coffin to spread among the cemetery workers and even the residents of the small town. At first, some believed it was nothing more than a case of desecration, but as more details emerged, broken chains, no sign of external tampering, and the complete lack of traces to justify the removal of a body, the rumor began to take on the form of legend, and soon there was talk of a curse, pacts made in life, and dark forces preventing the deceased from remaining at rest. With each repetition of the story, new supernatural elements were added, as if fear itself fueled the collective imagination, transforming the event into something even more disturbing. I remember the whispered conversations in the narrow corridors of the funeral home, where candles always illuminated the early morning hours. Some older people swore they'd heard of similar cases in other regions, where dead people considered heretics, witches, or men of unspeakable cruelty were buried under chains to prevent their return. Others, with heavy-lidded eyes and choked voices, insinuated that it wasn't the body that had escaped, but something far worse that had been released. The more I listened, the more I realized that, in one way or another, everyone avoided passing near that grave, as if the mere act of crossing that patch of ground were enough to bring misfortune upon themselves. I myself, who had so often walked those paths without fear of the darkness, began to change my route to avoid looking directly at the spot, and I confess that often, even in broad daylight, I felt a sudden shiver run down my spine whenever I approached that specific spot in the cemetery. It was as if the earth, previously silent, now had a breath of its own, a breath that patiently awaited the coming night. And it was precisely when the silence gained a sound, a whisper dragged by chains in the dead of night, that I realized it was not just a rumor. The nights that followed were the longest I'd ever endured in all my years working at the cemetery, for each time the sun disappeared behind the hills and darkness fell over the headstones. An eerie silence spread through the air, a silence so absolute it felt unnatural, as if all life around had fallen silent to listen to what was about to happen. I walked among the graves, trying to keep my mind occupied with routine tasks, but inevitably my ears picked up noises that couldn't possibly be there. The metallic drag of chains on the earth, the dull thud of something heavy moving beneath the ground, and even a muffled groan that seemed to come from deep within the graves. At first, I tried to convince myself they were merely the result of exhaustion, the delusions of a man scarred by fear and fatigue. But the more time passed, the clearer it became that there was something real behind those sounds. I remember one particular dawn when the wind suddenly died, and even the insects seemed to vanish, leaving the atmosphere enveloped in a suffocating stillness. It was then that I distinctly heard the snap of a chain being tensioned, as if someone were pulling hard on it, followed by a prolonged dragging that echoed throughout the cemetery. The sound didn't come from a specific point, but seemed to move, as if slowly making its way through the alleys, gliding from tomb to tomb until it disappeared somewhere I dared not identify. Sweat trickled down my forehead, despite the biting cold, and the feeling of being watched from all. Sides became unbearable, as if something invisible surrounded me, waiting only for the right moment to reveal itself. From that night on, sleep became nearly impossible, for every time I closed my eyes, it was as if the chains echoed again inside my head. The psychological weight gnawed at me, and I began to fear not only what was buried there, but what might have been freed. And it was precisely this fear that made me realize that the true horror had not yet begun. For what I had heard was merely a warning of what was to come. As the days passed, the chained grave became a sort of forbidden spot within the cemetery, as no employee approached it without feeling an unusual chill pass through their body from the inside out, as if that patch of earth exuded an energy that didn't belong in this world. I myself avoided walking there, but at times it was impossible not to catch my eye. Whenever I did, it seemed as if the earth pulsed slightly, as if breathing, as if guarding something. That wasn't dormant, but rather lurking. The sensation was so tangible that on more than one occasion I felt the ground move discreetly, like a wild animal restrained by an invisible cage. It was then that I understood that those chains were never placed to protect the living from external desecration, but rather to keep the dead in their place, or perhaps to imprison that which refused to remain underground. This revelation came not from books, nor from priests, nor from popular superstition, but from an instinctive truth that only those who were there could feel, a truth that burns like a silent fire in the minds of those who witness the impossible. And that is why today, so many years later, I still feel the need to record this account, as a kind of warning that cannot be ignored. If one day, anywhere in this vast country, you come across a coffin buried beneath thick chains and rusty padlocks, don't make the mistake of thinking it's just tradition or the exaggeration of a zealous family. Understand that those chains are the last barrier between us and something that refuses to remain contained. Never try to approach out of curiosity. Never allow the temptation of doubt to make you open or challenge what has been sealed by generations of fear. For if a single chained coffin was able to open itself, leaving behind only emptiness and the echo of broken chains, what guarantees me, and what guarantees you, that others are not just waiting for the right moment to do the same? During all the years I've worked surrounded by death, I've learned that some stories should never be told because they sound so absurd they'd easily be dismissed as the inventions of a gravedigger tired of always keeping the same silence. Still, there are events that refuse to remain buried in my memory because every time I close my eyes, It's as if I'm returning to that specific dawn, to that moment when I realized that logic and reason can shatter before a simple piece of stone. And it's precisely this memory that compels me to confess to you what happened in my very presence, even knowing that after hearing it, you may never see a cemetery the same way again. There was an ancient tomb in that place, built with the full weight of tradition and superstition, sealed with thick cement, and protected by a marble headstone so heavy that 4 men together could barely move it. It was the kind of tomb built to withstand time, rain, wind, and the curiosity of the living. And for decades, it remained intact, a silent marker of that which does not move. But what should have been the perfect image of immobility became a mystery that still sends chills down my spine, because in the early mornings I watched over that cemetery, I witnessed the impossible. A headstone that moved on its own, as if with a will of its own, opening what should never be opened. You might think I'm exaggerating, but how can I explain that on 3 consecutive nights I heard the dragging sound of stone on stone, a metallic echo that pierced the silence and paralyzed my bones. And more disturbing than the sound was the realization the next morning. No matter how much reinforcement it was, the tomb always dawned open, as if mocking the efforts of those trying to keep it sealed. If this story has already given you goosebumps, subscribe to the channel and leave your like so you don't miss the next stories that are yet to come. Hat, first night. The cemetery's silence was broken. I walked the damp paths, just to check that everything was in order, for the routine of those who care for the land of the dead consists of guarding the boundaries, ensuring no profane intrusion has occurred, and above all, ensuring that the rest of the departed is respected. The air was colder than usual, heavy with the smell of rotting leaves and damp cement, and the wind blowing through the trees made the wooden gates creak, as if the place itself were trying to warn me that something was about to happen. I walked, slowly but alertly, until a heavy, metallic, dragging sound shattered the silence so unexpectedly that my heart raced at an irregular pace, as if trying to escape my chest. It wasn't the kind of sound you'd mistake for falling branches or rolling stones, but rather a constant, deep rumble, reminiscent of something heavy scraping against the ground. I knew where it was coming from, even though I didn't want to admit it, because the sound echoed precisely from the direction of the ancient tomb, sealed for so many decades that no one even considered the possibility of it being violated. My steps, which had been confidently advancing until then, faltered the moment I understood the source of the noise. For a few seconds, I considered running, abandoning my post, and pretending nothing had happened. But the dark curiosity that accompanies every gravedigger overcame my instinct for self-preservation. I approached slowly, feeling every fiber of my body tremble, and the closer I got, the more the sound seemed to come to life, as if the marble stone were being dragged in slow, calculated movements. When I finally summoned the courage to shine my flashlight on the spot, I found the headstone slightly shifted, as if it had been pushed from the inside out, and I swear that in that instant, the early morning chill seemed to concentrate solely on me. I remained still, unable to comprehend how something so heavy could have moved unaided, much less without leaving any visible marks. Around it, at dawn, the scene was even more disturbing, for there were no signs of intrusion, no footprints, no tools, just the displaced headstone and a silence that seemed to mock my disbelief. And so the first night showed me that the tomb was unwilling to remain closed, and deep down I knew it wouldn't end there. For once death moves, it rarely returns to rest. The morning after the first incident, I decided to restore the tomb myself, convinced it was all a coincidence, or perhaps a cave-in, caused by the night's humidity. I spent hours reinforcing the cement around the base of the headstone, spreading layer after layer, as if I could imprison not only the stone, but also the sense of unease that gnawed at me. When I finished, I walked away with the false confidence of someone who believes they've put an end to a threat, even though, deep down, I knew the weight of the inexplicable isn't easily silenced. As night fell, I resumed my usual rounds, each step heavier than the last, as if my own feet resisted carrying me there. The moon, obscured by thick clouds, barely illuminated the path, and the cemetery seemed even more somber than usual, plunged into a suffocating silence. I walked for long minutes, trying to dispel the memory of the previous night, when suddenly there it was again. The dragging sound, this time more prolonged, more aggressive, as if the stone were struggling against something invisible that insisted on keeping it in place. The sound reverberated through the ground and hit me square in the gut, making every fiber of my body beg me to flee, but my legs refused to obey. I remained motionless, listening to that deep, creaking sound that seemed to carry with it not only the weight of a tombstone being moved, but the wail of something that should never be heard. With each passing second, the sound grew more intense, until suddenly it ceased as abruptly as it had begun, leaving the cemetery plunged into a stillness that sounded even more ominous. The next morning, I found the headstone out of place again. The cement I had painstakingly applied cracked in several places, as if invisible hands had pushed from within with impossible force. There were no tool marks, no signs that anyone had attempted to disturb the grave. There was only the weight of evidence that the tomb refused to be sealed. And in that instant I understood that this was not an isolated occurrence, but a phenomenon that would insist on repeating itself, night after night, until it revealed its true intention. By the third night, there was no longer room for doubt or rationalization, because something inside me knew that if I didn't witness with my own eyes what was happening in that tomb, I would never know peace again. Carrying only an old lantern and a mixture of courage and desperation, I positioned myself at a strategic point in the cemetery, close enough to hear every sound, but also far enough away to believe I would be safe should something terrible unfold. The wind blew in intermittent gusts, and each time it cut through the trees, it produced a sound reminiscent of distant voices, as if an invisible crowd whispered in unison. I took a deep breath and tried to convince myself that I was prepared, but the truth is, no man can prepare to witness the impossible. The hours crept by, until around midnight the familiar sound began again. Only this time it lacked the comforting distance of the previous nights. It was closer, more insistent, and seemed to carry a rhythm of its own, as if the headstone were being dragged by invisible hands that grew tired of waiting. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would betray my presence, and my flashlight trembled in my hands, casting wavering beams of light over the surrounding headstones. I stood still, watching as the sound grew louder by the minute, until it finally ceased, not because anything had ended, but because I realized, with a chill running down my spine, that the sudden silence was a sign I had been noticed. I tried to control my breathing, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming, as if dozens of invisible eyes were staring at me from deep within the earth. When I finally summoned the courage to shine the light on the grave, I noticed that the headstone was displaced again, but this time it wasn't just a crack or a small opening. There were deep marks, scratches running across the marble surface, as if something inside had tried to force its way out. The chill I felt wasn't just from the wind, but from the certainty that this grave harbored something I couldn't bear to remain trapped inside. And as I observed that disturbing scene, I understood that what was before me was not just an unexplained phenomenon, but a silent message, a warning that I still did not have the courage to decipher, but that would inevitably reveal itself, because the true horror was not in the movement of the stone, but in the hidden reason that made it move. In the days that followed, News of the persistently open tomb spread with the speed of a brush fire, and soon it wasn't just the gravediggers who whispered about the event, but also the town's oldest residents who found confirmation of old stories that until then had sounded like forgotten legends. Some swore that the tomb rested with a man condemned for crimes so cruel that he should never have been buried on sacred ground. Others spoke of an unfulfilled pact, a spiritual debt that even after death continued to exact its toll. And there were still those who spoke of ancient forbidden rituals performed in secret in times past that had left deep scars on the land. As the versions multiplied and each rumor gained traction as if it were an indisputable truth, I found myself consumed by the inability to find a logical explanation for what I had witnessed. I spent sleepless nights trying to organize the facts within reason, but each attempt ended in the same place. The tombstone actually moved, the cement cracked, and the early morning silence was always broken by the same dragging sound that seemed to mock my disbelief. The science I knew couldn't explain it. The faith I had inherited from childhood offered no solace, and all that remained was the anguish of living with the feeling that I had witnessed something beyond human comprehension. As time passed, I realized that the doubt was even more terrifying than the phenomenon itself, because when you can't find an answer, your mind begins to fill the void with the worst possibilities. And that's how I realized that perhaps it wasn't necessary to understand why that tomb was moving, but rather to accept that some dead simply refused to remain still. Over time, I learned to live with the idea that I would never have a definitive answer for what I witnessed. But that doesn't mean the memory has lost its power, or the fear has dissipated. On the contrary, every time I cross the rusted gates of that cemetery and let my footsteps echo among the tombstones, I feel as if the earth still holds a restless breath, a muffled whisper that insists on reminding me that not everything we bury remains in the place we choose. That's why today, in sharing this story, I'm not seeking to convince anyone, but to leave a warning that might help someone understand the silence that surrounds certain graves. Never be fooled into believing that weight and cement can imprison what refuses to remain. A marble tombstone may seem indestructible, but when the will that moves it comes from within, no barrier can resist. I saw with my own eyes, heard with my own ears, and felt on my skin the chill that comes not from the wind, but from the proximity of something that refuses to rest. I don't know if it was a spirit, a curse, or simply the manifestation of something that humans cannot name, but I know that in that tomb, something insisted on defying death. And that's why I leave you with my final warning. If one day, in any cemetery in this country, you find a headstone that appears to have been moved more than once, don't touch it, don't approach it, and above all, don't make the mistake of trying to close it again. Because if the marble and cement weren't enough to contain what was inside, what guarantees that the other graves around it aren't just waiting for the right night to move too? I've always believed that cemeteries hold more than just bodies buried beneath the cold earth, for within them also lie secrets that history has chosen to keep silent. But among all the graves I've had to guard, none came as close to the inexplicable as that of the priest accused of heresy in the 19th century, a man whose life was marked by controversies, rumors, and condemnations so severe that even after his death, his superiors and the community itself refused to trust in his rest. It wasn't enough to bury him. It wasn't enough to cover his body with thick cement. They even decided to nail a heavy iron crucifix to his tomb, as if the cross, a symbol of the faith he had supposedly distorted, could become a prison to keep the profane contained. For years, that grave remained untouched, becoming part of the silent landscape of a forgotten cemetery in the American heartland. Elders whispered that the crucifix wasn't there to honor their memory, but to contain something that shouldn't be released. I never paid attention to these stories until the early morning hours when the impossible happened. When I arrived for another round, I found the crucifix lying on the ground as if it had been thrown with force, and the heavy grave lid ajar, revealing that the silence of that grave wasn't as absolute as everyone believed. And it is precisely at this moment that the most disturbing part begins, because inside that tomb there were signs that no one would ever dare hope to find. If this story has already given you goosebumps, subscribe to the channel and leave your like so you don't miss the next stories that are yet to come. Long before that early morning when I found the fallen crucifix, the story of the heretical priest had already circulated like a persistent shadow among the region's oldest residents. It was said that in the 19th century, in a small parish in the American countryside, there lived a priest whose religious fervor had transformed into something dark and disturbing. Some claimed he had abandoned official doctrine to follow practices considered forbidden, mixing prayers with obscure rituals, invoking forces that should never be spoken of. Others maintained that his heresy lay less in his words and more in the arrogance of defying his superiors, preaching that salvation came not from the church, but from secrets that only he possessed. The accusations were so numerous that the local clergy had no choice but to expel him, and his death, shortly thereafter, was surrounded by even more disturbing rumors. It was said that on his deathbed he cursed his fellow priests, swearing that he would return to expose the truth they had hidden and that his soul would never rest in peace. That's why, when they finally buried him, they decided to build a tomb unlike any other. Thick cement sealing every crack, a heavy lid pressed against the box, and above it all, a massive iron crucifix meant not to bless, but to imprison. For decades, the tomb remained a silent symbol of collective fear. Younger generations didn't even know the reason for such care, but older generations never forgot the stories whispered around the fireside. That the cross wasn't a sign of faith, but a barrier erected against evil. Yet strange as it was, nothing seemed to move, and everyone believed that precaution had been enough. Until that freezing dawn, more than a century later, what was merely tradition manifested itself again in brutal and visible form, proving that not even the weight of iron could silence a dead man bent on rebellion. I clearly remember the early morning hours when that grave shattered the silence imposed for generations. For the chill that gripped the cemetery wasn't the usual chill of a winter night, but a chill that seemed to rise from the ground itself, rising through my feet until it froze my spine, as if the earth exhaled an icy breath, carrying with it the weight of an invisible presence. The wind blew in long, irregular gusts, causing the ancient trees to bend and make cracking sounds that echoed like bones breaking. And the sky, covered in thick clouds, hid any trace of moonlight, plunging everything into an oppressive gloom. I was walking among the tombstones with my flashlight in hand, accustomed to this shadowy environment, when a metallic sound cut through the dawn like a blade. A sharp crash, followed by a heavy dragging that seemed to echo directly from the priest's tomb. For a few seconds, I remained motionless, trying to convince myself it might just be an illusion caused by the wind or the rusting wood of some rusty gate. But the intensity of the sound was unmistakable, a powerful impact, as if something had been violently knocked down. I gathered my courage and approached slowly, each step echoing against the suffocating silence that fell between one gust of wind and the next. It was then that I saw the scene I could never erase from my memory. The iron crucifix, which for decades had stood firmly atop the tomb lid, now lay on the ground, tilted against the earth as if it had been brutally thrown. The tomb lid previously untouched, was slightly ajar, a narrow crack, but enough to reveal that something had given way, that the containment was no longer absolute. My heart was pounding so hard it seemed to reverberate in my chest, and in that instant I understood that this freezing dawn was not just another night of vigil, but the prelude to something much darker. For if the symbol of the cross was no longer held in place, what awaited me inside that tomb was about to redefine the limits of what I believed possible. I approached the tomb with hesitant steps, feeling that each movement toward that narrow opening pushed me away from logic and pushed me deeper into a realm where no rational explanation could possibly accompany me. The crack left by the stone lid revealed only darkness, a black void that seemed to suck in the flickering light of the lantern. And for a moment I considered retreating, pretending I hadn't seen anything, letting the silence take over and swallow up that strange scene. But morbid curiosity, mixed with a sense of obligation that every gravedigger carries, made me lean in and peer inside, and what I saw still haunts me today like an open wound in my memory. The coffin, which should have been resting in the same alignment it had been placed in over a century ago, was shifted a few centimeters, enough to leave marks on the cement surrounding it. The shroud covering the body was partially disturbed, and what disturbed me most was the realization that one of the arms, previously crossed over the chest according to religious custom, now rested at the side of the body as if it had slipped out of its own accord. The face, partially covered by the cloth, seemed tilted at a different angle than recorded in ancient accounts, almost as if it had turned in its sleep. No matter how hard I searched for an explanation, no. Outward signs indicated tampering. No tools had been used to move the lid, and there were no fresh handprints or footprints around the grave. What lay before me could not be attributed to the work of grave robbers or the pranks of reckless youths, for it would require a strength no one would have dared to exert in secret that early morning. The only thought left was the most disturbing of all. The body had not been moved by human hands, but by a will that came from within, a silent resistance to the repose that had been imposed upon it. And if that night only one arm had changed position, what could happen if the entire body decided to rebel against the invisible chains of death? The next morning, as the news spread among the cemetery workers and then reached the community, I realized I wasn't the only one bearing the weight of this secret. The elders, upon hearing about the fallen crucifix and the half-open lid, exchanged silent glances as if confirming a long-held suspicion, something that had been circulating in whispers but never admitted aloud. Some residents claimed the heretical priest had finally fulfilled his promise not to accept the silence of the tomb. Others swore the body's altered position was a sign that his curses were only beginning to be fulfilled. Even religious people were divided. There were those who tried to deny any possibility of supernatural desecration, insisting on natural explanations such as the erosion of time, the action of humidity, or the sliding of internal structures. But there were also those who, in secret, advised strengthening protective rituals, multiplying candles, erecting new crosses, and recommending nightly prayers to ward off whatever was awakening there. For me, having witnessed the scene with my own eyes, there was no longer any doubt that whatever lay in that tomb was not at peace. And each dawn seemed to bring with it not only the common cold of the night, but the omen that something greater was about to be unleashed. And it was precisely this perception, this feeling that the worst was yet to come, that made me understand that I needed to leave a warning before it was too late. As the days passed, I understood that this event was not a simple isolated incident, but a sign that certain forces refuse to remain underground, no matter how much concrete, iron, or sacred symbols are placed upon them. The iron crucifix, which should have been the final prison to silence any spiritual rebellion, lay on. the ground as a mute witness to the failure of human faith to contain what we call the profane. The half-open lid remained like an open wound in the cemetery, reminding everyone that silence was not absolute, and that perhaps repose itself is merely an illusion we tell ourselves to believe we control the unknown. Even today, when I walk among the graves and let my eyes rest on that tomb, I feel as if it breathes silently, awaiting the next dawn when it will decide to move again. I know I should never approach it, but I also know that the true horror lies not just in that particular tomb, but in the question it forces us to ask. If even iron and the cross, the ultimate symbols of spiritual restraint, were incapable of keeping a body in place, what guarantees that the other dead around us are? There are events that defy not only logic, but also our very notion of the resting place of the dead. And although I had witnessed disturbing scenes in my daily routine as a gravedigger, nothing prepared me for the dawn when I realized that even the earth, which should silently welcome those laid to rest within it, can rebel against its imposition. I'd always heard that heavy rain can turn entire cemeteries into rivers of mud, dismantling poorly sealed graves and exposing coffins that should never be resurfaced. But what I saw that night was not simply a consequence of the force of nature, but something that defied any plausible explanation. That storm seemed to carry an unusual weight, as if each drop were a hammer striking sacred ground, each thunder a warning that the silence would be broken. Walking beneath the deafening roar of the water crashing against the tombstones, I realized something was wrong, not by what I could see, but by what I could feel in the air. A strange unease, a premonition that the earth itself was hiding a secret about to be revealed. And indeed, at dawn, when we returned to assess the damage left by the rain, one of the tombs, which until then had been impeccably sealed, was mysteriously open, not by cracks or collapse, but as if exposed from the inside out. What we found there caused everyone present to recoil in silence, because before us was not just a violated tomb, but proof that even the dead can be returned against our will. If this story has already given you goosebumps, subscribe to the channel and leave your like so you don't miss the next stories that are yet to come. That night felt different from the first clap of thunder that rumbled through the hills. For it wasn't just the sound of an ordinary storm, but a deep rumble that reverberated in my chest, as if nature itself were announcing that something was about to break. The wind began to howl through the dry trees, tearing branches that crashed against the sodden ground, while the rain fell in gusts so intense they turned the cemetery into a sea of dark mud. Every step I took sank into the sodden ground, and the flashlight I carried could barely illuminate the path ahead, as the thick drops slid over the glass, distorting the shadows and making each iron cross seem to writhe under the violence of the night. The other gravediggers were there too, trying to contain the small landslides that threatened to dismantle the most recent graves. We worked in silence, not only because the storm muffled any words, but because there was an unusual tension between us, a sense that we were fighting a force greater than simply the rain. From time to time, a flash of lightning illuminated the entire cemetery, revealing rows of tilted tombstones and moss-covered statues that for a few seconds seemed to come to life in the fleeting white light. It was during one of these bursts of light that I noticed something strange in one of the oldest tombs. There were no obvious signs of collapse, no cracks in the marble that might indicate fragility, but the surrounding earth seemed to have moved unusually, as if it had breathed under the pressure of the water. The sight disturbed me, but I attributed it to exhaustion and the growing dread the storm was inflicting on us, and I continued my work, though the discomfort remained throbbing in my chest. As the dawn wore on, the weight of the water on the cemetery seemed to increase, and each clap of thunder sounded closer, as if it were moving toward that specific grave. I couldn't explain it, but everything led me to believe it wasn't just the rain trying to break through that night, but something waiting for the right moment to break free. When the sun finally broke through the early morning clouds, bringing a dull, heatless light, we walked through the cemetery to assess the damage left by the storm. Water had run off, forming deep grooves between the graves, mud partially covered some. Headstones and the most fragile trees had fallen under the fury of the wind. It was a desolate scene, but nothing could compare to what we found a few meters away, in an ancient grave that, until the previous night, had been perfectly sealed. The earth around it had shifted strangely, not scattered as in common landslides, but as if pushed from the inside out. The marble lid remained intact, without cracks, without signs of breakage, and yet the opening was there, gaping before our eyes. I approached slowly, trying to comprehend the scene, and the more I observed, the more impossible it seemed to believe that it could simply be the result of the rain. Coffins normally resist waterlogging, and when they give way, the earth deforms into irregular blocks. But what lay before me was different. The opening was nearly symmetrical, as if something had pushed with millimeter precision, rejecting the prison in which it had been placed. The other gravediggers looked at each other in silence. None of us dared to break the moment with words, knowing that any explanation would seem futile in the face of such an obvious fact. Mud still oozed from the edges of the grave, creating patterns that resembled finger marks or claws reaching the surface. It was disturbing to think about, but the image loomed large and unmistakable. It didn't seem like the rain had opened the grave. It seemed like someone or something had decided to leave. The mind struggled against logic, trying to find answers in the randomness of nature, but the weight of the inexplicable crushed any attempt at rationalization. And it was precisely when we summoned the courage to look more closely into the interior of that opening that the true horror revealed itself, because we found not just an empty space of disturbed earth, but a presence that had left the prison of death to show itself in a way that none of us were prepared to face. When the space before us finally came into clearer view, the shock was so great that no one dared speak, for there, exposed in the sodden mud, lay the body that should have been sealed forever within the grave. It wasn't in a static position, as we typically find in exhumations or when the earth gives way. There was something deeply disturbing about the way the corpse was laid out, face down, arms outstretched, as if it had dragged itself with a desperate effort to reach the surface. The face, covered in mud that the rain insisted on spreading, seemed distorted in an expression of pain. And even with its features worn away by time, it was impossible not to notice the anguish etched on its face. The already deteriorated clothes were stuck to the body by the weight of the water, and strange marks could be seen on the back, scratches running in irregular lines, as if the body had been pulled or scraped against something as it struggled to get out. The most terrifying detail, however, was on the ground around it. Deep grooves that began at the edge of the grave and extended a few inches beyond, resembling the marks of claws or hands that in their desperation had dug into the mud in an attempt to drag themselves out. None of us dared touch the figure, for the scene seemed more alive than dead, as if it still lingered within the echo of a final movement interrupted by the violence of the storm. We stood paralyzed before that body, and every second of silence felt like an unbearable weight. My heart pounded, my breath caught in my throat, and a single question hammered inside my mind. How had a corpse, sealed by layers of cement and marble, ended up outside, in a position that betrayed self-exertion? Reason told me it was impossible, but my eyes, which would never forget that image, insisted on telling me otherwise. And it was in that moment of disbelief that I understood that the true terror had not yet spread, because if we, gravediggers, were already gripped by fear, what would happen when the community discovered that even the earth, in its funereal function, seemed to reject the dead it was supposed to guard? Neither of us could take the first step toward that body, for the mere thought of touching it seemed like a challenge to something we still didn't understand. We remained motionless, exchanging heavy glances, each of us seemingly waiting for the other to take the initiative, as if assuming responsibility for dealing with that scene meant forever carrying the weight of what we had witnessed. Some colleagues murmured that they had never seen anything like it. Others swore that the marks in the mud weren't static but slowly spreading, as if there was still movement, an invisible dragging that continued even after definitive death. I wanted to believe it was just a trick of the exhausted mind, but deep down I knew that this shared fear couldn't be reduced to collective hallucinations. The rumor spread quickly among the employees and within hours reached nearby residents. Some claimed the rain had revealed an ancient curse. Others believed the deceased soul had never accepted the forced rest, and still others said it wasn't the storm, but the earth itself that had refused to welcome him. The local church tried to silence the conversations, asking for prayers and suggesting we reinforce protective rituals, but it was too late. The image of that body, face down in the mud, was already etched in everyone's minds. It was at that point that I realized the true horror lay not just in the sight of the exposed corpse, but in the certainty that the entire cemetery now carried a new atmosphere. If the earth could return a dead person, who could guarantee that the other graves would remain quiet when the next storm struck? As the hours passed, the body was finally placed back in the tomb, and the marble lid was reinforced with fresh cement. But neither the weight of the work nor the murmured prayers of the most religious could dispel the feeling that nothing we did would be enough to contain what had unfolded that night. I watched in silence, my hands still trembling, unable to shake the image of the corpse lying face down in the mud, as if it had fought until the last moment to escape the prison that had been imposed upon it. With each distant thunderclap, it was as if the memory of the storm reminded me again that it wasn't over, merely waiting for the next opportunity to repeat itself. Since then, every heavy rain approaching the horizon sends a deep shiver down my spine, because I've learned that the earth doesn't always accept what we give it. The cemetery may seem like a place of eternal silence, but that night I understood that it can also become a stage of resistance, where even the dead seem to reject rest. If you've made it this far and want to continue following real and disturbing stories like this one, subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story. There are even darker secrets waiting to be revealed, and I want you to be with me when the time comes to tell them.